나가서 가상도 초와서 군도가 나네다 초와세 디 가르람나 랑기 용위기 에네 지라는 용위기 용위 천에서 유지 냠수 용위 천에서 비 리바지라 네 초와라 초와세 되는 시에 사지 어디 뭐디지 나도 그런 게 그런 게다 바 예와를 쳐봐이나 아니 델이야 아니 지다는 니치리도 체타들 리그미도 유베나는 니치여도 루서다 셈소리 이세 치기레스 근데 루서랍나 가서 왕시기 모기베 소와디길 루서체 아니 이기시베 모기베 소와들란 셈소라세지 어두시기 예와 이수체 야델이야 아니 지게 이수체디 안에 사체기 소와다 사미기 소와세야 대신이 되네 니체다 직체 나 되네 야지 소와를 숨도 쳐도 소와 대와 동아 다음세지 어두스 숨도 치고레스 아니 가상가도 디걸 쉬르와
Good morning. So last night, having now resumed our classes on mind on Lorig, we've come to the presentation on the omnipresent mental factors. And last night we started to look at the first one in some detail, that of feeling. So feeling, we saw, is defined as a knower that is distinguished by being that which experiences. We looked a bit at the definition and thereafter started on the divisions. We looked at both of the twofold divisions. Firstly, that all feelings can be divided into those which are physical feelings and those which are mental feelings. And what differentiates them is a physical feeling, or the feeling that is called a physical feeling accompanies a sense consciousness, whereas a feeling that is called a mental feeling accompanies a mental consciousness. And then we looked briefly at the second of the twofold divisions, that all feelings can be divided into those which are materialistic and non-materialistic, or contaminated and non-contaminated. And then we came to the third division, which is the most commonly used, and that's feelings being divided into feelings of happiness, feelings of suffering, and feelings of equanimity.
아디네 자당 안주기 때 지게 대화되바다 동아 미디바리 세당 안주기 동아 세고고리 세나다 대화 두고고리 세데 라데 주비아디당 안주 대화 세데다 정 소위기 대화 세바이나 델량 초와 대화 나라야 릭몽보여 사세기 대화다 사메 초와 대화 이 안델라 사메기 초와 대화달라 안주기 제 림바 마손노 토름기 림바 몽보여 와 지나다 단다 또소데 가르송고라스는 안주기 지제 안주기 초와 델이야 초와 대화 델이야 왕실의 땜비기 초와 대화 치리고래 니 왕실라마 땜모가 이기신비 오규 초와 대화 중고래 지산 니니버티 안다 수이 뉴버체 마손 가레스 뉴버치게스 이기셰바 이게 왕실의 땜바지 이기셰베 때네 초와 대화 중에도 뉴버체 차고 지상안저다 심전 대화대 되나 세야디 지사 심전 탐절라 니게 초와 디기 약보지 용어쇼 심비 초와 대화 심자도 동안에 전화 쓰되 심자도 동안에 초와 동안 용하디 파 디매바 용하쇼 심비 삼다야 딩아도 디 시거로가 다 가상가도 디 거시로와.
And moreover, last night we looked at the usage of the word, the term feeling in the general context of the Buddha Dharma as well. Recalling that all beings desire only happiness and want to be completely... Oh, sorry, I forgot to plug this in. And all beings want to experience only happiness and to be completely free of suffering. We looked at what this means in relationship to feelings. That the happiness and suffering there refers to feelings. And moreover, we looked at this term feeling, or otherwise translated as feeling tone. There's a great variety in terms of from a very subtle up to a very coarse and manifest or obvious level of feeling. And so having such variety amongst feelings like this, or a gradient amongst feelings, there too will be a great an expansive gradient in terms of happiness as well. And happiness can be divided into that which is contaminated and that which is uncontaminated. And happiness, or the feelings of happiness, these can be associated then with those, the feeling of happiness that is associated with the sense consciousness, so in other words, physical feeling, and the feeling of happiness that is associated with mental consciousness, so mental feeling. So we looked at this last night, and then amongst these two, which is the more powerful, which has the greater impact on one? And that is mental feelings, or the feeling associated with the mental consciousness. And it's this then that we as individual practitioners need to focus on cultivating. And moreover, in the context of generating the mind of love and the mind of compassion, here the mind of love is the wish, may all beings experience only happiness. And that happiness there is the feeling of happiness. So here we understand that it's the feeling of happiness, and in particular, it's the happiness that comes, that it is mental happiness, the mental feeling of happiness that is associated with the mental consciousness. And likewise, what we're particularly aspiring to in terms of compassion, may all beings be freed from suffering. This is referring to the feeling of suffering. May all beings be freed from the feeling of suffering, both subtle and coarse, and then particularly referring to the mental feeling of suffering. So this too we looked at last night.
소와 대화디 중간 주기를 끼어도 nga 대우도 nga 기후에 기후 조사라 그러와 당아 저 소와 동아디 되니게 nga 저 조디 갈라 어다 nga 기후면도 nga 대우면도 세징아 아 저기 지디 용달이야 대화던 동아세 뭐 소야디 더 소와 동아다 소와 대화니디 뭐 소대야 소와 대화디야 되는 사직의 소와 대화 책을 하나 줄이야 아 저기는 미용을 소야 되라.
Furthermore, we as ordinary beings, and you can say in general throughout amongst all ordinary beings, in answer to the question we ask ourselves or others may ask of us, how are you? We respond to this in relation to the feelings that are dominating within us. So if we say, yeah, I'm quite happy, or things are going well, we generally refer to our feeling of happiness. Or if things are not well for us, then when we respond in this way, either to someone directly or just in our own thought process, this refers to how we relate to our feelings of suffering. And here, these feelings of happiness and suffering, which are in the context of how are you, these then refer to contaminated feelings. So the division on the top of page 22.
디네가 매바 소바 잠징아도 동아 매바 소 차려 말에 제가 동아를 릭미다와 숨용고래 다당아 좀 외송해도 동아에 동아세들이스 동아 제가 될래야는 유유 동아세시어래 안 잡아주지 동아세시어래스 제가 유유 동아세데 가르려네 대화 사치디게 사치게 대화 돌아 내가 직직된 대화 사치 대화디 대신 소와 대화디게 유유 동아 차용을했어 제가 당아도 수기 풍보디 레다 녀모가지고 풍보디 잡아주지 동아래스 제가 데니기 동아리 숨요래 디숨가 매바서 고래 빵고 디숨가 매바 sö바 있는 빵바 있나 데는 안 저에게 탈바세도 투고래 데니 땡기 대화 투고래 대화 안에다 대지 대화도 사실 사메스 대화실 사메기 대화도 투고래 숨고래다 투고래스 녀모와 나중에 다 dunga 나네 캬바 두지 dunga 숨가 빵빠나 빵노도 는 가서가 저 사맥 대와 토기 땡이 대와 톱사와래 되네 dunga 기도 요 말해서 그러와
To look at this further so that last segment was about how people in general in the world, or beings in general in the world, relate to feelings. But now let's look at it from the context of the Buddha Dharma. Suffering that we all long to be freed of can be divided in many different ways. Best known, or the most common division, will be the threefold division: the suffering of physical and mental pain, the suffering of transient happiness, and all-pervasive suffering. Amongst these three, it's only the first, the suffering of physical and mental pain, that people in general, and certainly ourselves, are directly aware of. And this too refers to the contaminated feeling of suffering. The coarsest form of suffering, with the suffering of physical and mental pain, is contaminated suffering. And we need to be freed of this. But not only this division of suffering, it's all three, including the suffering of transient happiness and the suffering of all-pervasive suffering. All three we need to abandon. When one abandons all three of these sufferings, where the third is the all-pervasive suffering, which is relating to or referring to our contaminated aggregates, we then attain liberation. When we have completely abandoned the afflictions and the seeds, we attain liberation. When we abandon the afflictions, then we experience, the happiness we then experience is non-contaminated happiness, or the feeling of non-contaminated happiness. So this is the progression between the two. So we're looking at the division on top of page 22. The contaminated feelings are what we're experiencing now. They're infused with or related to the afflictions. When the afflictions have been abandoned, then one only experiences happiness, and that is non-contaminated, the non-contaminated feeling of happiness.
Den masaba teleshidene deyangs dewadan dunga ganrola chowe kyap tanyumla chowe makyapsi de kanjile jidan ngazo dewa seda dunga labaina chowa singor mato dewa labindo chowa dewal ko dewa chingore dunga labdo chowa dunga lingor chowa ingore mato mesu chowa mayin besu ta an deme janda la dewa da dunga se la yo maresisa dewa lamna chowa dewa ko gore dunga labdo chowa ingo chowa dunga ingo 그래서 동안 대화다 동안라 강론라 초와임에 캡스 초와임에 인구를 해서 그러다.
So that concludes the review of what we looked at last night. So let's then continue where we stopped. So let's look in the middle of page 22. Although whatever is happiness or suffering is necessarily feeling. So this first half of the sentence, whatever is happiness or suffering is necessarily feeling, means that when we talk about happiness and we talk about suffering, and attending classes here, these terms you'll be very familiar with, they come up repeatedly. These refer to the feeling of happiness, the feeling of suffering. And so this is good to bear in mind, that when we hear about happiness and hear about suffering, it's referring to the feeling of happiness and the feeling of suffering.
다 셈다 셈중 세는 거 셰바들 리니 셈다 셈주스 니체로다 제나다 리니 체도 당은 저 셈세 리티 차산 대화 말해서 그러봐 대화야 말해 동화야 말해 가서 그 초와 말와 셈세 되게 셈디 대화야 말해 동화야 말해서 네 그 셰바래서 아니 야 다디나다 셈중 나라야 셈중 장가 마이와 망고치도 셈중 업중 아직 요래라로 당 업중 아직 나네 아니 몹중 얼굴이 제사 가서래 대화 동화가 말했어. 가서 초와 말어. 초와 마인 캔게 심중 강이 가리 몹중 아직 지여도 초와 마인 초와 직지로 초와 지여도 ane di lama shanda chowa mayingen sheba semjung kana shine dis chasan dewa mare dunga mare so chisanda dewa da dunga sedir chowa le kogure inji mi chowa yin kogure so
part of the greater Lorig text, or awareness and knowers text that we are in, is dividing all consciousnesses into two, main minds and mental factors. Main minds, these primary consciousnesses, are consciousness, but they are not happiness or suffering. Happiness and suffering is a mental factor, but amongst the many mental factors, the 51, 50 of them are also not happiness or suffering. Only one is. That is feeling. So feeling has the function of, as we saw in the definition, of experience. And so it's feeling that has the function of experience, namely happiness or suffering. So therefore, again, whenever one hears about happiness and suffering, it is necessarily referring to the mental factor of feeling.
The donkey Gili no said the Dimata Shanda Chasa no Mari, like Supu Chashe Mango Chasa no Mari, no said the Gima di Dimato and no Mari like and Dinach in the shape Shepat Legic Mango or dead, Dewa Duma said the Caso Soa in Guri as this Chibari that you Chagara.
To really make this clear, let's take what we're more familiar with, and that's our physical body. So our physical body, we can all divide into many different parts. We got a left arm, a right arm, our hands, our fingers. We've got our eyes, our head, etc. And we have a nose. And amongst all these different parts, there's only one that we can call a nose, and that is this one, this part here. We can't call any other part of the body nose. It doesn't fulfill the function of a nose. So this we understand very clearly with our material body. And it is precisely the same with our consciousness. We have many different consciousnesses, they've performed different functions, but there's the one that performs, that is a knower, or consciousness, that is distinguished by being that which experiences. And it's that one that is feeling, and therefore performs the function of feeling, and is that one that experiences happiness or suffering.
That Tanyum said, and the Soa in Gurivas and Della Soa in Goya Malaysia. Tanyum said, Tanyum Soa my chapters, Soa in Gumares. Tisan Tanyum said, Soa Mayankan, Tanyum Yores, and the Tanyum La Soe, Soa Tanyum said, the Soa Tanyum Sada, and Dujeta, Gawa Juchin and Duje Tanyum said, Semet Tanyum said, Tanyum La Rigmira, Sums Chair Yores, that it is a Tanyum de Lenchimit Soa Tanyum in Goya Mares.
So in the context here of the threefold division of feelings, and so we've seen now that feelings of happiness and feelings of suffering mean that, so happiness and suffering are necessarily feelings, but the third division, that of equanimity, will continue. Whatever is equanimity is not necessarily feeling. So the first two, happiness and suffering, are necessarily feeling, but equanimity is not necessarily feeling. This is the mental factor of feeling. This is because, with regard to equanimity, there are three. Equanimity feeling, equanimity of application, which is included among the 11 virtuous mental factors, and immeasurable equanimity.
I don't know the Dewa, love you, Dewa, Dunga. Tanyum Lagurua, Chisa, Dewa, Lavido, Oda Chowaching Gurias, Lamsan Chowaching Gurias and sometime. Dunga Lavido, Oda Chowaching Gurias and sometime. Tanyum Lavido, Della, Choa in Gayora, Chawama in Gayora, Injimich Soa in Kuga Mares, on Dewa Dunga, Tanyum Lavado, Dewa Dunga Labdu, Injimich Soa in Tanyum Lavado, Injimich Soa in Kumares.
So therefore, going forward, when you hear the words happiness and suffering, immediately know that it's referring to the mental factor of feeling, and necessarily is so. But when you hear the word equanimity being discussed, that does not necessarily refer to the mental factor of feeling. It may well do so, but not necessarily.
다다 젤이야 당보 초와 제바이나 초와 대와 초와 동아 초와 땅님 진 두샤르면은 내 자산다 초와 자르고 그래. 초와 대와 초와 땅님 람나 대와 람나 초와 대와를 그거 땅님 가서 동아 람나 초와 동아래. 다 초와 땅님 람나 초와 땅님 람나 다 초와 인간 땅님들이 계시고 돼. 초와 이미 잡다. 민가도 랍지컬 초와 대와 초와 동아 초와 땅님 슬랍제 두슬랍에네 자산 초와 자르고 그래. 다 초와데 맞아와제 대와 동아 땅님 슬라베네 대와도 동아니들 땅 초와 인고래 땅님라도 초와 인고 말해서 두스 캐바체로 와다.
If you, in the context of hearing a presentation on feelings, and you hear about a feeling of happiness, feeling of suffering, feeling of equanimity, it's very clear there that each of these three are feelings. Or if you hear a discussion of happiness, suffering, and the feeling of equanimity, again, whilst only one is explicitly stated as a feeling, the feeling of equanimity, because we now know that happiness and suffering are necessarily feelings, one will understand that all three are feelings. But if one doesn't hear the feeling of equanimity, but just the term equanimity, then be aware, possibly, now the feeling of equanimity is being referred to, but possibly not. One needs to hear from the context to understand which, what is exactly being referred to when one hears only the term equanimity.
땅님을 개와 주식이 나서 집에 뒤에 땅님 세시어레스 내 땅님래 이나다디 내 초와세데 말해서로 당한 저게 뒤에 땅님라도 내디 내가 소화라는 셰버 코롱 용위기 대두 가요 용위 용어 끼되긴지라 초와기시어로 다들 땅님라도 초와 내 가서 다들 땅님 뒤에 땅님다 체매 땅님라도 그런 거 유디를 미비셔 유디 직바 삼다야들 땅임식으로 아마도 그 유디 ben에 체매 땅임라도 sem전 탐제 체매바 sem전 체매바 바도 매바시 미제 sem전 차사다 대화도바도 동아미도 직바래 다냠래서 sem전 탐제 랑야 아니 지게 랑게 sem전 탐지기 판버 두고에 직바래 마도 디 판버 두고 디 판버 두고 말삼단 예링 차로다 예링 매바 삼다와들 땅임식으로 지상도 개와되네 개와 두두가라 뒤지 개와 주나 뒤지 땅임서도 셴야 아니 지게 예링 원기 ben에 셴야 소수게 차배 원기 셈다 냐와 차야다 안 소수를 봐줘들라 나게 원기 소수 셈다 링와 차죠와 니 예링 차송로와 지사데 예링 매바지 니가 되니기 차바다 셰단기 니기 초소 마송와지 셈 기만 내제 네 주야 될라 개위 자와 주야 될라 맞기 안에 개와 땅임사 차고래 지난 체매 땅임라도 셈전 탐제 셈전 체매발 미제 셈전 탐제 대화도 지바래 삼야더라 셈전 탐제 니 콘주기 된다라 판도 두고 지바래 마도 지기 판도 두고 디기 판도 두고 말에 셈베 삼 땅겨 말에서 디니 지바 삼 땅여도 체매 땅임시고 니코 유딜라 찍받다고 그래. 근데 다데 땅디 땅임니. 제가 콜 땅임스가 유기 체내 콜 땅임세시고 그래. 제가 진짜 초와인 거야 말. 나도 소와 땅임라도 그런 게 셰바 그런 거 내용어 맞게 봐지 누가 용어 맞게 봐지 그런 기마기 찍게 되겠더라. 초와 땅임세고 그래디. 그 초와 땅임세도 그런 거 계산에 체내 유지 용이 기회 체내시고 그래. 다른 이보디 그 유딜 파 따당을 찾기시고 제가 디네자 디네게 땅 참마 땅임세야 뒤제 땅임세야 되게 안에 가서 초와 말해서 디나데다 셰바 망보여로 와다 디네 딱한라.
So you understand then these three different ways that three different possible meanings for equanimity. Let's divide them into two. The one with the first one, A, the equanimity feeling, then on the other hand, equanimity that is one of the 11 virtuous mental factors, and immeasurable equanimity. So B and C we can put here, and A we put here. So A is the equanimity feeling. Being a feeling, it fulfills the definition. A knower that is distinguished by being that which experiences. So equanimity feeling is a knower or a consciousness and awareness that experiences. It experiences. Its entity is one of experience, and it's a consciousness. So therefore, we're talking about an object possessor, a consciousness that experiences the object. So what primarily distinguishes A from B and C is that it's referring to a consciousness. It's referring to a consciousness, and specifically a consciousness that experiences. B and C are differentiated from A primarily in that they are referring to the object that the consciousness is interacting with. A is referring to the consciousness itself. B and C are referring to the object or the way that the object is interacted with. So that's the primary difference. The first one refers to a particular consciousness itself, a particular mental factor that is experiencing the object. B and C refer to the two objects themselves and how they are being related to. So then, that is how to differentiate the first from the second and the third. Then what are the second and the third beyond that they're referring to objects? So the equanimity, the virtuous mental factor of equanimity, this refers to relating to an object not through closeness or distance. When we relate to, for example, someone with closeness, there's usually attachment involved. When we relate to someone with distance, we want to be apart from them, separate from them, there's aversion or anger involved. Whereas the virtuous mental factor, this virtuous consciousness of equanimity, is between those two. It's not under the influence of attachment and therefore closeness, or aversion and therefore distance from the object or the person or the thing. Rather, it's equanimous between the two, and therefore can relate in an impartial manner. So that's the second one, the virtuous mental factor of equanimity. So here from that description you can see it's how one relates to the object, not with attachment, not with aversion, not feeling close or distant, but equal between the two. The third has some similarity, immeasurable equanimity, but here the object is sentient beings, and immeasurable sentient beings, limitless sentient beings. So the object is clearly external, it's sentient beings, immeasurable sentient beings. And one is not relating to, and one has come to understand that all sentient beings, all limitless sentient beings, are equal in terms of wanting happiness, wanting to be freed of suffering. And through this, one wants to relate to them equally, impartially. So this is often translated as impartiality rather than equanimity. But the word in Tibetan is the same. So one wants to here be impartial towards all sentient beings, not feeling close to some and distant from others, because they are the same in desiring happiness, the same in terms of wanting to be freed of suffering, and therefore it would be inappropriate to relate to them differently on that fundamental level. So this then is the third type of equanimity, measurable equanimity. Again, it's focused on the object. Here, all sentient beings, seeing them as equal in terms of their desire for happiness and freedom from suffering, and therefore having an impartial attitude towards them. And so the B and C are similar in that they're focusing on the object and having an impartial attitude or an equanimous attitude towards the object. An object can be sentient beings or a thing. The first one, A, is an equanimity, a feeling of equanimity. So here, this is relating to a consciousness, or referring to rather a consciousness and how it experiences its object. So that's then the three different ways that equanimity can be related or can be understood, and only the first is a feeling. That's the threefold division then of feelings. So another way to take this mental factor of feeling, this consciousness or knower that experiences, and come to understand in more detail, one can divide it into 5. And that we also have on page 22. So I'm going to read out a literal translation of the 5, which will help then with the paragraphs that come afterwards, which really are not very clear for us in English. But so put a few of the words in the 5-fold division in brackets. There's nothing incorrect there, but it will make the rest a bit clearer later. So the 5-fold division is first a feeling of happiness. Then mental happiness. Suffering is the third. The fourth, mental unhappiness. And fifthly, a feeling of equanimity, or equanimity feeling. So I'll read the literal translation again. Happiness feeling. And then secondly, mental happiness. So put feeling in brackets. Then thirdly, suffering. So put feeling in brackets. And then fourthly, mental unhappiness. Again, put feeling in brackets. And lastly, equanimity feeling.
당보 초와 대화 세셔와 대신한도 초와래 예와 숨체도 초와 대화 당임 동아 당임 여 숨체와 지상 당보 나도 예와 숨체도 초와 대화 세야디 나로야 대화시 거기 초와 대화의 20이 거기 초와 대화 네가 초와 대화 간지네 디나의 취대로와 차상 고고 초월로 숨체비 qabla 초와 대화 라비어도 아는 저기 디나의 와시 거기 초와 대화디한 고투그래 아니 20이 거도 주요 초와 대화디한 네가 고투고래 초월로 숨체 요도 초와 대화 세야 돼 다다 초월랑아 세대가 예와 치디 qabla 초와 대화 라비어도 술라고세 와시 거기 초와 대화들 라고마도 20이 초와 대화들 라고 말밍 지금 와시디 초월랑아 치비기 초와 대화 라비어도 가르고 그랬으네 와시 거기 초와 대화들 고고래서
First, before we start explaining the 5-fold division, let's refer back to the 3-fold division. There we're seeing the first one is feelings of happiness. The feelings of happiness refers to both happiness, a feeling of happiness that arises with a sense consciousness, so it would be a physical feeling of happiness, as well as the feeling of happiness that arises with a mental consciousness, so a mental feeling of happiness. So both of these are included within 2.1, the feelings of happiness. Now when we come to the 5-fold division, those two are split out. They're enumerated separately. So what we have here in the first division as feeling of happiness refers only to the feeling of happiness that arises in conjunction with a sense consciousness. In other words, a physical feeling of happiness. So therefore, you can add another word here in brackets to make it clear, physical happiness feeling. And that is what the 3.1 is referring to. So the Tibetan is just literally happiness feeling, but it's referring only to the physical happiness feeling, in other words, that which accompanies the mental factor, the consciousness of feeling, of happiness that accompanies a sense consciousness.
사다 초월랑아 예와 체여도 이제 숨치도 대화 라도 초와 대화 라면도 디나네 20이 초와 코드주 초와 대화 다 와시고 초와 대화 니가 유대로 다대가 체여도 20이 거기 초와 대화들 민가라서 갈다고 이디에센다고 이디에세 자 이디에 라비도 20이 거기 초와 대화들 고고래지래
Then the second one, which literally is in the 5-fold division, is mental happiness. So this then, or mental happiness feeling, this then, in the threefold division, is the second part that's included amongst feelings of happiness. So feelings of happiness in the threefold division include both physical happiness feeling and mental happiness feeling. Now in the fivefold division, these are split into two. They're just made enumerated to make clearer. The first three, one, physical happiness feeling, and the second, mental happiness feeling. So therefore, what's in the threefold division, in the fivefold division, is just enumerated in more detail. That's the only difference here.
당저 초월로 숨치비 qabla 대야 민다에도 초와 대화라 그러와. 다 초월랑아 치비 qabla 초와 대화라 그러. 거기 민직벌에도 와다 초와 대화 찍발라기도 와. 제자다 초월랑아 치비 qabla 초와 대화 세디 왕시하고 초와 대화 임바데 가능스 하고 그래. 라면도 니바데 하고 이데 세디 나체도 이데 세디 개발 로샤 이데라도 이라도 이기시발라고 이기시베 대화라 그러와. 진짜 이기시베 초와서 20에 초와서 그런 무수 랍사로와 라면도 대진이라 초와 대화 세디 20에 초와데 말에 라면도 아니 가르레라도 와시 거기 초와 대화래서 니바데 하고도 걸 초와 대화다 이데에서 예와 체여도 아니 이데라서 20에 코 초와 대화데 로수 그런 랍사와 인자 초와 대화 세디 와시 거기 초와 대화도 고 제가 초와 대화들 20에 초와 대화다 와시 거기 초와 대화 니마도요 말와 매도 20에 초와 대화 랍사와 인자 뒤에게 와시 가서 초와 대화스라도 와시 거기 초와 대화 임바도 고토 그래제 대체상 당한 중에 초와로 숨체도 초와 대화라도 초와 대화 누가 땅염 라마도 20에 초와 대화 기시고 말와 매도 초와 대화라도 니가 여바데 주되래 당아체여도 초와 대화 이디에 라로하다 제가 이디에라도 20에 대화 초와 대화 로스 셰바 인자 디니 초와 대화라도 다 와시 거기 초와 대화도 고고래서 고토 그래 고야데 투 그래제
So the fivefold division is just enumerating further the threefold division. And we can also see how it incorporates what was included right at the beginning, the first division, the twofold division. So the fivefold division is just to make it really very, very clear that when one refers to a feeling of happiness, so from the third division, the threefold division, that can be one that arises in conjunction with a sense consciousness or a mental consciousness. And then in the fivefold division, this is just enumerated further. So here in the fivefold division, when we see the first one, a feeling of happiness, we need to then understand that this is referring to physical feeling of happiness, which means it comes in conjunction with a sense consciousness, such as touch or taste or smell. Whereas mental happiness, this is the feeling that comes in conjunction with a mental consciousness.
다디네 다 동화 세들에 지사다 델레 동화다 이미디에 세지 지사 동화 라면도 와시 거기 좋아 동화듯이 와시 거기 좋아 동화들라 동화래 거래 다 이미디에라도 이시 거기 좋아 동화 세 이 좋아 동화들 이미디에라 거래 지사 이 동화 라면도 당한서 지단의 동화 라면도 동화들라 좋아 동화 20에 좋아 니가 샤되로 와 이내다 디나래 인가체도 동화 세디 와시 거기 초와 동아리 임바데 간에서 하고 그러려도 니바데라 이미데 라여도 이기 20에 코도 주 초와 동아리 라여도 니래 동아라여도 오다디 초와 동아라여도 다 와시 거기 초와 동아리 임바데 하고 두고 그래서 동아다 이미데 사디 이기 20에 코도 주 초와 동아리 고고로 하이
Then let's look in the fivefold division at the third and the fourth. So here, again, it follows the same principle as we've just had before, where in the threefold division, feelings of suffering, there included both types, the physical feeling of suffering and the mental feeling of suffering. And these now are differentiated or split out in 3.3 and 3.4. So the third one, which literally in the Tibetan is only suffering, of course, refers to a suffering feeling, and in particular, physical suffering feeling, which means it arises in conjunction with a sense consciousness. And then the fourth one, mental unhappiness feeling, which means a mental suffering feeling. This arises in conjunction with a mental consciousness. So therefore, 3.3 and 3.4 are just a deeper enumeration of what we had above, the second feelings of suffering.
That's what Danyum said. That's what Danyum said. Jignal Changa. Then that's what Danyum led dinner. Wash your Danyum, the Yishi, Danyum Niga, that dinner jig to Janshabare.
Then lastly, 3.5, equanimity feeling is the same as we have above, feelings of equanimity. Here, this hasn't been differentiated in terms of whether it's accompanying a sense consciousness or a mental consciousness. So therefore, it is identical to 3.5 is identical to 2.3.
Now, big number of several server in the district of Rabin, so what you said, so Langa Yawa Chen, Lucia Koyu Soa Diawa. The immediate Yishi Kodu Soa Diawa. Then one she Koyu Soa Dunga, Ishi Koyu Soa Diawa, Dunga said, and so what Danyum. Delaya, Nisha, one she Koyu Soa Danyum, Ishi Koyu Soa Danyum, said Juba Session, and several Charo, Zangmaraji, go to Goma Hoya.
And for those who particularly enjoy bearing enumerations, then you can take this this threefold division, and we can divide this up further. And we can do this now with clearer language than perhaps is in the fivefold division. So the first is feelings of happiness that are physical, feelings of happiness that are mental. So that makes 2. The second one, feelings of suffering, we can divide in the same 2. Feelings of suffering that are physical, feelings of suffering that are mental, making 4. And then feelings of equanimity that are physical, feelings of equanimity that are mental. Or maybe it would be better to express it as mental feelings of equanimity, physical feelings of equanimity, and above, mental feelings of suffering, physical feelings of suffering, and mental feelings of happiness, physical feelings of happiness. And then that is as clear as one can get, and now we have a sixfold division.
That's what Danyum said to me. Jig to Janshama, Yawa Nichene, also soon your marine, don't I need your dinner, Janget Yawa Chidi Kablo, so what Danyum the Nichene Yawa Chayama. That did much of you go on to Daddy did so Yawa Chia de Shung, Chigani, and Zoedan, and Chig Kundu that didn't know Sungo Rochesam. Digos corns to the Cheque, Mogobi, Kimsen, and Guava, which corns to the Chetu Chevi Dushagi, or Dinesoyala. Dushi come now, Mabal doing the Sumbaza, Gasuba in the Guava Kimsen, Mangochi, Cesa Dandala, Dina Soa Time Nana, Ishiko Soa Time, Nashi Soa Time, Niger in a Jigma, the Janka Mate, Janka Yamoeva, that Duschen, and Janga Yawa Chequadi, Guava Kimsen, Mangoyu Chagarwa.
Just to explain then why this 3.5 equanimity feeling hasn't been divided into 2 like the ones above, happiness and suffering, is because the source material for this presentation, the two the upper and lower Abhidharma texts, the Compendium of Knowledge and Treasury of Knowledge, these two source texts present equanimity as one, so that, without dividing it into 2. Hence, this briefer text here, the Lorig text, is leaving them as just the one equanimity feeling. But now we know that the meaning is that there is a physical equanimity feeling and a mental equanimity feeling.
That idea in that they were in the champion, so all Narchi, they are my instead, this Rodan and the champion message. Just an idea of the girls and Ichiko to a Dewadimba. Just not that so long achieve they all of the Lucico to a Devara, just not the Mares. Idea della and so long achieve the Devad reverse in Mares, so a Deva Marella or yes.
Now we come to the 2 brief paragraphs beneath the fivefold division, which just explain what has been presented above in this fivefold division, because as we've seen with needing to add words, the fivefold division isn't explicitly clear, but is rather presented beneath this. Whatever is mental happiness is necessarily happiness. Where am I? Whatever is mental happiness is necessarily happiness, but is necessarily not the happiness that is within the fivefold division of feeling. And then this is explained in the next sentence. So whatever is mental happiness is necessarily happiness, but is necessarily not the happiness that is within the fivefold division of feeling. This is because whatever is happiness within the fivefold division of feeling must be a physical feeling of happiness. So what this is saying is that 3.1 should, if it was written as a physical happiness, it's explaining that its happiness feeling refers to physical happiness feeling. So that's all that is being said here. And it's being said in this way because this is how it's expressed in the source material of the treasury of knowledge, the lower Abhidhamma, and the compendium of knowledge, the upper Abhidhamma. But all that's being expressed in these two sentences is that 3.1, it means physical happiness feeling.
당한저 군종아 산다니버 유행아세들 레버 유행아세다 유행에뱅아세다 군종아세 당한저 셰바 간데나 셰바 지유나 딩아본 님도 여여 봐요 군종아도 초와 두시 셈바 일라지바 자방아지 셰바 안데 딩나 디 군종 셈중아래 셈 간에지나 디 콜야 딩아디 냠도 여여 봐요 단 냠도 제바나 셈제 군종 초와 두시 셈바 일라지바 자방아 콘소 죽 냠도 셰바 간에지 이나 디 데니 죽념도 여여 말이다. 제가 데니에서 군조 라비도 셈 간에지기나 디 념도 두고서 군세나 상마념도 줘도 인자 여바 인자 군조 아세 콘좀 군조 셈중 군조 아 디가로 쪼셈시되다 콘좀념도 줘서게 셈 쪼셈지라 셈지라 될 쪼셈 쪼 예번아 쪼어디시 안 디고 코르랍디 코로바로 심마선데 나디시 콘조 죽다 념도 셰바 간에지나 디 죽념도 여여 말이다.
Feeling is the first of the 5 omnipresent mental factors, the others being discrimination or differentiation, intention, mental engagement, or often called attention, and contact. The reason for these being called omnipresent is because they always accompany a main mind or a primary consciousness, always. So what we have translated as omnipresent literally means all going, kundro, all going, which means every consciousness, all consciousness are accompanied by. So instead of go, we could take it as accompany. Every main consciousness is accompanied by these 5. So therefore, every thought, no matter how brief, is comprised of at least 6 consciousnesses. One, which is a main mind or primary consciousness, and then the other 5 are these 5: feeling, discrimination, intention, mental engagements, and contact. So these 6 are a minimum for each and every consciousness.
단이버 유행아 세죠. 다 유행아 데 가래라네. 단데레 딤바 메바 템바 띵이지 셰랍 세팅가 보디 유행아 시고래.
The 51 mental factors, as we saw a few pages before, are divided into 6 divisions. That was the first. Now we come to the second on page 23. The second division of the 51 is a group of 5 called the object ascertaining mental factors, which are aspiration, belief, mindfulness, stabilization, and wisdom.
디 나보디 셈 간디시나 냠도 두고를 베신 다 조비 내봐요 말에 대소 개위 셈 릭지 냠도 두고래 냠도 미기 왜셈 나데니 냠도 좋아해 미주 두고 말에 매반사 안에 데니기 유행아 시도 그런 게 유행해 봐래서도 그런 거 줘서 유딜라 내봐래서 맞아 유 고한한테 남가 될 줘야 내봐면 디션 두고 말해서 저러봐 저 남가 디고 줘야 내봐래서 그거 다 줘 봐래서 진짜 유행아 니 듬보디 그런 거 그런 계획이 유지를 냠도 줘야기 유지를 미야기 땡해 봐래서 유행해 봐래서 맞아 미기위기 계획이 유지라 안에 대용 말해서 제가 유행아 아이도 진짜 셰바 차상 냠도 다 컨트롤고 말 계획 유래미 비고 조셈 셈이네 디코도 용시 용그래 미개월 용 말이지 미개월 냠도라 유행아 세리 두고 말해 직장 두고 말해 나 말은 직장 제자다 가르도스는 계획 유지라 셈지다 냠도 디 두고 그래 제자다 유행아서 유행해 버려서 계획이 계획 유기 지를 냠도 두고 말도 미개월 유기 두고 말해서
The the 5 we've just looked at, object as the omnipresent mental factors, called omnipresent because every consciousness has these 5 accompanying or together with each consciousness. So therefore, every consciousness, when divided, looked at in finer detail, has at least these 6, a main mind and the 5 accompanying omnipresent mental factors. This division, the object ascertaining mental factors, do not accompany every consciousness. Should a consciousness be virtuous, these 5 accompany it, but they do not accompany a non-virtuous consciousness, a non-virtuous mind. So the 5 of aspiration, belief, mindfulness, stabilization, and wisdom serve the function of ascertaining the object of that consciousness. So the consciousness or the object possesses its object, and these 5 ascertain that object. So if there's an object here and there's somewhere else, these 5, due to these 5, one ascertains this object, not going off to another object. So that's the function of these 5, and they accompany virtuous consciousnesses, virtuous minds.
당은 고대화를 시변에 변해가지고 군동아 세대 셈 간데시나고 셈데 기회 셈지나 냠도 군동아도 용물에 두고 요레스 다 미기회 셈지나야 디 냠도 군동아도 요레스 어디 차사줄 셈 간데시나 딩을 군동아도 냠도 요요 버려야지래 다 유행하세디 기회 셈지라 개와다 미기회 셈이기 나네다 기회 셈지를 냠도 줘야게 해봐래마도 미기회 셈나 냠도 유행하디 좋아요 말이에요. 제가 그런 념도 줘서 유디 그걸 해봐래. 세지. 기회 있으면 념도다 뒤용 거마다 미기회 있으면 념도 뒤뒤 와요 말이지. 기회 셈제. 기회 셈지 맞지만 되지. 상 기회 셈념도 kontunga가 기회 셈념 주고래 제가 되지 군동아 나신 주고 찍바래.
If we divide consciousness into a different way, into those consciousnesses or awarenesses which are virtuous and those which are non-virtuous, we can now say that those which are virtuous will comprise a main mind, its 5 omnipresent mental factors, and its 5 objects ascertaining mental factors. Therefore, will have at least 11. A non-virtuous consciousness will have only 6. It will have the main mind and the 5 omnipresent mental factors, but not these objects ascertaining mental factors, which these 5 only accompany virtuous minds.
Zandenegida, you so ngebe, you call Yunge Lago, Kimjagars, you so ngebe, Yunge should be said. That is called Tashiro Chire. That in it on Lume Losha.
And again, then, the reason that these five are called object ascertaining is that's what they do. They ascertain their object, or they ascertain the object of that consciousness.
That Dumbe, Dumba said, La Carjos, Dumbe Yule, Dunshin, Dunduyer, said Dumba said, Digi, Yuji, Michi, Yudu, Dunduyer, Dumba said. Maybe Della Yaboras and a Kawajeva, Gajubat, Mabas. Jampa said, Digi, Yudi, Macheba Zimba Della, Jampa, Jampa Koran together, Legal Masona Kaga Chatter, or Legal Masona Zimba. Dingin said, Digi, you like same the you did, Zechidu never cheva. The sheriff said, Digi, the in the Karina man, Jevachi, so sort of Jepiki, Jeva, Koranzuke, Legal Masona Kaga to Dineshiro, the Jawachitan, Koran's Java.
As I mentioned last night, when we looked very briefly at the grouping of the five omnipresent mental factors, they are all consciousnesses, and they are differentiated in terms of their function. So, in relation to the particular function a consciousness performs, it is called by the name that it has. So, similarly here, with these five varying consciousnesses that are grouped together as object ascertaining mental factors, they are a particular consciousness that performs a specific function, is given a specific name. And that we see presented here with the bullet points. So the consciousness that aspires to or strives for an object is called aspiration. A consciousness that engages with its object joyfully is called belief. A consciousness that apprehends the observed object and the aspect is called mindfulness. And the consciousness that abides one-pointedly is called stabilization, and wisdom is the consciousness that analyzes individually.
Da dangbo dede Dumba said it. Dumba dan Deva, Dunya said, Donachibares, Minghar, Donachibares.
And then the first of these, aspiration, we see immediately below. It has some synonyms: wishing or striving.
And
Then this last line, we just need to change the translation of one word here. Thus, if there exists an aspiration that seeks a certain phenomena, for this joyous effort for the sake of that phenomenon is begun. So that's a little bit clunky, but the word effort is actually the word for joyous effort. So we should rather include that because joyous effort has a particular meaning. So when there's aspiration that seeks a particular phenomenon, a particular object, then with joyous effort, one engages with it. So the reason for changing it is effort is an aspect of joyous perseverance. So joyous perseverance is often translated as joyous effort. So therefore, effort is an aspect of it, but there is another aspect, that of joy. Hence, it's better to use the fuller word here to give a clearer understanding of what it means.
듄바 세디 당한 저기 베네 셴랴 펜버 두디기 직 셴랴 펜버 지두기 선배 삼다나 듄바 차거와 다베네 니 람디 냠는 지긴 선배 니 지긴 선배 뒷날 토보도 쓰지 dondoñene dumba chagorwa denegi dumba chagorwa chisa ta gewi jawa ta dumba sedi gewa chag gewa ligore gewa chagor chisa dumba dilatene jebu dewa jungyo bana de dumba chagore dumba chagor chisa dumba so gewa san korongi jebu maon bana ne dewa jungyo bana de dumba de donye기 dumba sedi gewarwa.
At the outset of looking at the segment, it was mentioned that the object ascertaining mental factors relate to a virtuous object. So therefore, if the object is virtuous, it has a result of happiness. The feeling of happiness will follow from what one is engaging in. So let's look at the first then, aspiration. And we'll utilize the two synonyms here as well. So to give an illustration, wanting to benefit others, wanting to help others. This is an illustration of mental factor of aspiration. So having the aspiration to benefit others or wanting to help others. Another illustration is having the aspiration to achieve a path or striving to achieve a path. So these then would be illustrations of aspiration, and we can see there that the object that is being ascertained is a virtuous object, wanting to be of benefit to others or help others or striving to achieve a mental path.
Jidin begi Geshe Thubten Rabten ko di lega di bene simje sokju che da be de delya ji yu ji le je de yin jorwa da denege samlo di dumba rebe lamna dumba mare la gorda di dumba mare dewa mare dönyer mare la gorda.
So here it's then important to point out or to respond to a doubt which is likely to have arisen. If someone, for example, has the aspiration to kill an animal so that they can sell its flesh and make some money, then they have the aspiration to kill the animal, they have the aspiration to sell its flesh because they want to make some money. And this is how we talk in the world, and that's fine, it's not a mistake. And moreover, it would seem to fit the presentation here, because they have the aspiration to kill, they aspire to kill, they will strive to kill. But that doesn't fulfill the meaning of what is meant here. So whilst this is how we talk in the world, this is not what is meant in our context here.
Kuni dobu chagorde ina nga zugi jina jione jigdin bigi kishidu delia jigi deba di jibaro chagorde ina da dumba labdu de nemu de dumba labyo du yu dila dumba la du nga zugi lugda tumbigi dumba che yu dondo nyawa che jesa lugda tu jion da ga je dumjene denbaro shi Döndü yudi döndü yerba ina ane mahomba na nganzo le nyoba miyo achida ndi debu pando yoba chi di yo achila di döndü yerse ora jesa da pando meba deni cheba na kanga cheya chida mahomba dunga di döndü yerba ge dönyer dumba lobe dumba la o ming dela ya lobe dönyer seada ane je lobe deba sa cha ming dine charu ora inza dumbangon에 말에 벤데 semje södege shu yede da semje södege dumbarowan be semje sögme samba pamba jidige samba지다 södege samba 니보디 니가 delya jawadil jegi shukchembo yoba imbar chigla an chigdi phando yoba chigje chigdi nyoba yoba chigje mo bana 내갑들이나 뇌바 편이야. 마음에 지부이나 대륙 연구여가지. 디네 이제 직디 현래 팬바 제고도 선배 삼로디 셈조디 dum바원에체. 센심조 소고도 선배기 되니기 슈크첨보데 삼로 셈조디 dum비기 독초 가서래 로비 dum바스. 디디나심 나디 가서래 되니기 다 니디 람냠len 제고도 선배 삼로디 곧 되냐기 dum바세. 다디네데 제고 민도 지기어 말해 선배들 삼다한데 곧 슈지데 로비 되냐서 차로 봐. 제 디네 자디 디차고래.
So certainly in the world, one can express this person has an aspiration to kill, and that's correct usage of the word. Likewise, someone has the aspiration to be of benefit to others. So both ways of using the word in the world both ways of using the word in the world is correct. But in our Dharma context, someone who has the aspiration to kill, that is not this mental factor of aspiration. That is wrong aspiration. Someone who has the aspiration to be of benefit to others, that is aspiration. And what differentiates them is the result that will follow from their activity. Someone who has wrong aspiration the reason that an aspiration is called wrong aspiration is because it will result in suffering, problems, and difficulties. Whereas the person who has the aspiration that's referred to here, the result of that will be happiness. So that, therefore, if the result of the aspiration is happiness, then this is called aspiration. But if the result is suffering, then it is called wrong aspiration.
지바 존주세에 아주 개위 자와직이야 가신 구비권에 내가 배지 제게 삼로데 배지 제바들 존주라고와 존주세. 저 개위 자와직 제바. 아니 디게 되니게 배 갈랑라진 제가 제도 존주와 갈랑라데 존주와 이 무티 갈랑라지 무티네 제게 되바데 존주와. 그래서 디 개위 자와 제바 빼는 샬이야 팬버 두두기 샬라 팬버 빼야 그래서 갈랑라 진 델이야 자와들라 지금 무티디 삼 제게 되바디 삼로디다 존주샤로라. 그래서 디 델라 때네 제부 가려용으로서는 샬리야 팬버 두기 되니기 델라 때네 샬라 팬버 두번 샬라 팬거래. 디기 제부 마음반에 소소리나 디기리거와 존주디. 다야 찍라 샘전 수야리아 배 갈랑라 좀 거우슈진 샘전 수야기 지대 수야기 돈달이야 지게 배 지게 줘라. 디 다존주기 독서 차로라. 로비 존주사 차로래. 그래서 디가 저월스네 디기 코드디에 제보디에 샬레 샘전 소 쪼고서 베디지 베지디 샬라네. 아니 라라야 디 마음비게 제보이네 라라 동안요야게 제보기야 차고. 그래서 디 로비 존주세요. 개위 자와제 갈랑라제 델레 제두기 무디네 제두기 삼바디 존중원에 되지 존주치 디비 자와제 제할이야 무디네 델이야 네 삼로디 다진 디 제디 존디 존디 로베 존주세 민다고래.
And this can also be understood through looking at the last line. Thus, if there exists an aspiration that seeks a certain phenomenon, joyous perseverance for the sake of that phenomenon is begun. So this term, joyous perseverance, it means specifically with delight, persevering or making effort in virtue. So the term joyous perseverance, in its name of that consciousness, makes no reference to virtue, but that is in the definition. It's persevering with delight in virtue. So for example, someone who has the aspiration to be of benefit in the world will then, with delight, with joy, will persevere, will make great effort to fulfill this aspiration. So this is how the word joyous, or the term joyous perseverance is used. It has these two aspects of joy and perseverance or effort, and it's in relation to an object that's virtuous. That being said, people certainly do make great efforts or persevere with joy in non-virtue. But that is not called joyous perseverance. So whilst the name can be applied, it doesn't fulfill the definition. So therefore, in ordinary usage, we can say this person with great joy makes efforts in killing, for example. But that is not joyous perseverance, because it's not virtue. It doesn't lead to happiness. If we want to call that joyous perseverance, then it needs to be called wrong joyous perseverance. And this is because the object, it is non-virtuous because it will lead to suffering. For it to be joyous perseverance, it's engaging with delight or joy in virtue. Then it can be joyous perseverance. Hence, these relate only to virtuous objects and not non-virtuous objects. There we would talk about wrong aspiration or wrong joyous perseverance. So certainly in our everyday, the way people speak in their everyday usage, they could certainly say that someone is engaging with effort in virtue or engaging in effort in non-virtue. Or they could even use doing so with joy, and maybe say joyous effort or joy in either context. So that if people speak in that way, that's fine. It's not necessarily grammatically incorrect. But when we're approaching it from the perspective of the Dharma, we need to understand that joyous perseverance is only used in relation to virtue. People who take delight in and make great effort in non-virtue, then we can say they're taking delight and effort, but we should not use the term joyous perseverance or making joyous effort, because that relates only to virtue. And if one particularly wants to use the word joyous effort or joyous perseverance, then one needs to include add the word wrong. So wrong effort, like that. So again, just in our everyday way of speaking, this is how people will use these words. But for ourselves, when we're reading texts or hearing teachings and we hear joyous perseverance or joyous effort, we know it only is used in relation to virtue.
아니네. 당연 저기 지나다 거부세대 지디 영라랴 오고 심지어서야라 거부요래서야다 오고 창도야라 거부요래서야다 어디는 지어로와다 디베제 거부스 비슷한 거와 진짜 원에 가지고다 낭비 최내 기시류 셔다 거부세디 가유 유지랴 아니 뭐바 제바데 가와시고로 가유 베네 팬비유 샤라 미니오라시니가라 마뉴바 디니기 제바네 될야 아니 약보래 삼바이나 디네 가위 베네 사미 고랑기 샬레 펜바 제바 펜베 주고이나 디니기 판도 주여디 아니 델레 약보래 삼바이네 델라 가와시고로와 셴기 심쟁기 속주지 지기여버 토나 델레 약보래 삼나 디 가와 말해 고 가위 유체가 셴기 심쟁 속주여디 셴레 뇌바 지고마다 어디 야고 말해 삼야마도 가해기 유코라 체거 말 진짜 심쟁 속주 토나 어디 그 쓰여서 빼하고 쓰여서 약보시했다 약보래 삼바이네 디 가와 말해 다그 펜베시 줍체네 약보진 그 약보래 삼바나 가와래 진짜 펜버 주바디 가위 유제 그래서 데라 라신이가래 디기 용거래 셴라 동화제 심지어 속주지 동화 제바인 제데 디 gayu mare digi rashin이가 뇌버티고 산 gayu mare 제상 안 저기 지진 요다 아다 맞아 낭비 최내 시에데 가와 세디 유 가유 유지라 가세가 유코랑 현래 팬비기 다네 몽바나랑라 판도 용하게 되니지라 매바 제바들 가와서 비슷한 거래 현라 뇌바 제지라 야보레 선반에 야고코로 말와 삼면 노주 야보레 샘제 현재 샘제 쇠반 야보레 섬도 노주로와 제가 디 가부 제반 가와디 가와 야보레 섬에 가와 말했어 제가 디 나주 흉내 시대 디시고래 이내 당도 지진배 가게 나게 시도 코 샘제 소시제라 가부요래 코 창동야 가부요 코 제마제라 가부요래 세 가부 시로 디 가부딩 아주 디나데 셰비게 다 가소래 매바시아다 가와세 매베 가와 대화라 가서 매베 대라 가버 주비시세 가와 어디 가와 말에 가와 원에 책이 맞았어 맞지 지tim비 가게 나라 가와서 그 베지 따래 마도 단단 원에 가와 책이 맞대
This understanding that I've presented here apply now to the second of the object ascertaining mental factors as well. So that is the mental factor of belief. Belief engages that object joyfully. So again, as I said in the previous segments, the word joyfully we can use in any context, and it is used in many contexts. People with great joy will drink far too much beer. Some people with great joy will fish or they'll hunt. So these aren't virtuous objects. But this is how people talk, and that's fine. But in our Dharma context, when you hear the word joy or delight, then it's referring to a virtuous object. And again, what differentiates an object, if one wonders, so is this behavior or is this object, is it virtuous or not? That depends on this result that will come. If there's benefit for oneself and others, if it leads to lasting benefit, if it's accumulating virtue, it's a virtuous object. And then one can utilize, with the Dharma meaning, the word joy. So here, when we see the second mental factor here of belief, which engages that object joyfully, because the word joy is there, we know the object is virtuous. So it doesn't explicitly say the object is virtuous, but one can come to understand that this is implicitly stated because of the word joy. So therefore, when the consciousness that engages with the virtuous object with joy, such as the consciousness that engages with benefiting others with joy, that consciousness fulfills the function of belief and is therefore called belief.
아디네 숨바 개와 주주의 델라가르슨 대바 모사 셰바 체여바 마차바 셰다미비 셈주 디모메비 셈주 네 전주 사디 전주 신도 장바 바예 당염 넘버 미체와 남 안에 라기 도초 마테발레 도비코네 개와 주주 개월 길변 개와 주주 있음 다 개와 주주 장에 자야 되가서 미개와 주주여 봐서 미개 주주기 독초디다 지 독초 차바래 제자 코드 개와 주주리 해서 그래.
Then the 51 mental factors that we've seen are divided in 6 groupings. And that's the first 2. We'll now move to the third, virtuous mental factors. And here we see them listed. Faith, shame, embarrassment, non-attachment, non-hatred, non-ignorance, joyous perseverance, pliancy, conscientiousness, equanimity, non-harmfulness. And the text goes on. They are virtues by way of turning away from their opposites, non-faith and so forth. Thus, they are called the 11 virtuous factors and are a definite enumeration.
나는 남이 대바세야 되는 저기다 대비 유서다 저기 점내 상예다 최다 기준다 디민비게 계획자 개발이야 디 야고래 선바디 대바시로 다 모사셰바 시디 나 소소라 삼당제 샹리아 뇌버체 제미아들라 아니 모사시아 봐서 어denge치네 마 가소레 니 디파사기레 아니 야고 말씀죠 소소리아 아니 마호바나 소소리아 디네 강할 디네 자 소소레 잼네 소소라 되데 니 디치네 디 말에 섬 소소라 섬다지 아니 샹리아 뇌버체게 잼바텔라 니 모사시아 봐서
The first then, faith. So this one hears about quite often in terms of having an object that one has faith towards, such as the three jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, or one's lama. So this would be the mental factor or the consciousness that has faith in a virtuous object. Then the second, that of shame. So just to say as an aside, so here this term in English usage can have some negative connotations. Here the usage is more specific because it's only virtuous. So the meaning of shame is it's a consciousness that is directed towards oneself in the sense of towards one's own physical behavior, verbal speech, or way of thinking. One sees that what one has done is non-virtuous and will lead to suffering. And then the consciousness that recognizes this is one of shame.
다 집에는 안 저기 샬라 됐을 어덩이 디제바나 라미 가다 가그리스는 라마 투니가 말했으면 삼다야 되네게 삼다지가 두 제미야 다 되네 제반 오다 니 디제바네 셴기 안베 지게 나래야 레안에 지게 디하고 말해서 균조 용야 다 셴기 통그리에서 비게 삼다지 맞이야 되라 샬라 되네 잼바들라 안에 가서래 가서 채여 봐서 채여 봐서 내 잘알 미스는 디레 받아 Bene ngosa shebane mi mangbuchi dine yodi kabla sosuge dhamara shebane karsamus o nga ngosa uchagiri nga jik mi diago marasme jine nga tongshong charuwa samje dine samje ma zemba de dan che yoba sidu dan jine mi mangbu yosikala adi jik jebane da mi shiyans mi dhamara jik gyunje chigiri diago marasa samdada mi meba ine mi mesa chigine da kangbodo jala shune 다디 미스제민의 헤르거 선배용식으로와 디네자 다데려야 미통에나 하다 안에서 지금 상계다 저기서 같은 원식이 시고를 제가 라미네 디게 지금 구마고요 송고 제장이 디지면 라미가다 가그래 안에션다 두신네 온두신 생기 삼다지 않은 아주 디발을 잼바들 쳐요 봐시고 육다 셴라 녀바 디발 자위 잼바데 모사셰바는 최여번 이게 지바레데 이네 김전 삼다다디 모사셰바스 랑기 김전 조어 삼단 거래 최여바세데 현기 현을 뛰어봐 조어 삼단 거래 삼다다 개발디 맞으 현지바래.
Then the third, embarrassment, has a lot in common with shame, because both shame and embarrassment are in relation to non-virtuous behavior that one may have done or may be doing or may be planning to do. So which will relate to physical behavior, verbal communication or a way of thinking. So that relates to both shame and embarrassment. The difference is, as you heard with shame, this is internal in the sense that it's directed towards oneself by oneself. Whereas embarrassment is directed by others towards oneself. So those which are external to one, towards oneself. But this is still our own consciousness. So here, embarrassment would be those who are around me, what would they say if they saw me doing this or heard me saying this? How disappointed my teacher would be in this behavior, how disappointed society or my loved ones would be in this behavior. So here, it's one's own consciousness, embarrassment, thinking about one's own potential non-virtuous behavior or past non-virtuous behavior, but thinking about it, what would those outside of myself have to say about it? Whereas shame is about what oneself has to say about it. So for example, sitting here, if you see something you think, oh, I'd really like that, embarrassment is probably what will stop you from stealing it, because everyone will see. What will they say? What will they think of me? My reputation will be destroyed. So therefore, this consciousness or this mental factor of embarrassment will prevent us from engaging in non-virtue because of what others will say. Shame also prevents us from engaging in non-virtue, but it's in terms of what we say about ourselves. For example, with stealing, if we go into a room looking for someone and they're not there, and we see something very nice, we could steal it. No one would see. But we think to ourselves, is that the kind of person I want to be? And therefore we don't steal it. So here, this consciousness, in this case thinks, is that the kind of person I want to be? And therefore we don't engage in virtue. This is called shame. But if we are in front of others and we want to steal something but we don't because of what others will say, that consciousness is called embarrassment. So therefore they are both the same, shame and embarrassment, in terms of stopping us from engaging in non-virtue, but the one is in relation to ourselves, shame, and embarrassment comes from how others will perceive us.
마차바 세데 안주 율라 차바게비 차비기 마게바 바 차바 마게바 제 까바 삼로딜라 다 마차바시고라 차비 도저도 율라 차바기 차바 도저 차바제 다 셰당 미비 심중 세데 셰당 세데 셴리야 네 당화 삼로디로와 셰당 콩 셰당로 디 도서 샹라 마당와 당한주 샹라 가유에 삼바 삼 잠바 세디기 셰당 미비도 셰당 미비 심중 샤고라 스타디소레.
Then non-attachment, and okay, this should have been changed, non-hatred, so non-hatred, non-anger. In English we have anger and hatred, which are quite different. In Tibetan it's just one word. This difference isn't made. So if you see hatred, just think anger. If you see anger, you can think, well, don't think of hatred, but the meaning is, in Tibetan, they don't make the distinction. So the consciousness that is non-attachment is a consciousness that stops attachment. Similarly, non-hatred, the consciousness that is called non-hatred is one that stops anger. So for example, one could call love, for example, non-anger, because love fulfills the function of preventing anger. And therefore one can call love non-anger. And then again, a consciousness that stops or blocks attachment, that consciousness can be called non-attachment.
Na timu mebe simjo la de timu la de yuge tapine kewe chawa ni na di ane tela tine tribu kewa ta akasa dewa yungyo ba ni so hamo ko ati ta kan che kewe chawa ta kewe chawa dubye ge hamo ko ati timu chawa hamo ko ati lokora timu che timu mebe simjo la de di do sho da di dinigi kewe chawa da dini tribini so hako yage samdo chagurwa.
The sixth one, non-ignorance. So let's rather call this maybe non-confusion, because there are different words in Tibetan for ignorance. This one is more of a not knowing. So it is often called ignorance, hence it's widely here as a mental factor called non-ignorance. But it's not the ignorance we're used to hearing about. This is specifically a consciousness that blocks a confusion. In other words, not knowing. So for example, what to engage in, what not to engage in. When one doesn't know what is virtuous and non-virtuous, for example, then one has confusion about what should and shouldn't be engaged in. This is a contrary consciousness. So non-confusion is the sixth one.
다 신도 장바 세디 난 내내 신도 장바 때라 개와세데 가서를 등하는 주기 난 류신도 장바다 샘신도 장바 세용그래 제자되네게 신도 장바가 저기 신의 줍체 신의 주변에 검겨되더니 류샘래 강하기네 매베게 대랑랑 주야 중국어의 소리 신도 장파 사지.
Then the seventh, joyous perseverance, is as was looked at previously. So therefore, it's this persevering or making effort with joy in virtue. Then the eighth one, pliancy. So pliancy, there are two types. There's physical pliancy and mental pliancy. And this is achieved when one attains calm abiding. When one actually attains calm abiding, then one has both physical and mental pliancy. And what this means is that one will not experience any physical difficulties that hinder one's practice or mental difficulties. Ninth is conscientiousness. So this is also translated as being careful, which is an aspect of conscientiousness. So conscientiousness is a better translation. And it's in relation to be conscientious about engaging in virtue and not in non-virtue. So therefore one would be careful not to engage in non-virtue, but due to being conscientious about ensuring that one stays virtuous, one's mental train of thought remains virtuous.
자 당님 세대 대시다 개와 주나 당님 세대 대시 셰데 제가 샘 개위 초 가서 샘 차바다 차베 원도야 마다와 한샘 에너지 트위위 원도 셴리아 당위 삼바 데니기 토네 차단 이 원도 마다와 제 셴리아 샘 셴리아 다다들이야 기마다다 다야디 다 디샤고르 개위 삼다 다야디 당님 세대 샤거와.
The 10th, equanimities, as was mentioned earlier. So this is where one is equanimous in relation to others, not being attached and therefore close to some and averse and therefore distant from others, but rather seeing them as equal. And this is equanimity.
number 미쳐와라네 셴리아 네버 지금에 셈베 삼로 책으로 number 미쳐 셴리아 채와 지금에 셈베 삼로다 number 미쳐와시라.
And 11th, non-harmfulness, is then the commitment not to harm others at all.
아데네 디소다 데네 주기 샤와디 미기베 도초 인자 미기베 도초라 아니 샤바자다 개와 죽치샤 디샤르자 랑게 도초 마데바 솔레오 도베고네 개와르 규르베 개와 죽치시 장애기 샤베 치르스 지상 콘줄레 개와 죽치 샤바디 가르스네 코로나족이 마데발로 소베디 죽지 데 미거 죽지요래 디 미거 죽지고 독초디다 개와 차로 그래 디 인자 고 개와 죽지선도 장게 잡아래지 개와 죽지선 장게 잡아래스 다디디 개와 죽지 장게 잡서 디가르지서 미거 죽지고 독초래 독초 인자 독초 죽지래요 세상 코도 죽지래 개와 죽지선 장게 잡아래지.
As read earlier, they are virtues by way of turning away from their opposites, non-faith and so forth. Thus they are called the 11 virtuous factors and are a definite enumeration. So what makes them, so the being virtuous, one is blocking or stopping from going in the direction of non-virtue, and that's part of the function they perform.
원장 뒤선 대비 유 많이 민발라 대바다 미기외 초라 전반이 대바다 전지 딱바와 인지 대니가 뭐 많이 봐 개발 제고 예고소서 다디 제자 대비 유 많이 뒤스에 현래 체진 뇌바 제행기 대니기 jel야 안데 야고래 삼제 대래야 대바 체베네 대바 딱바오르마 대봉원에 말했지 대바 책 말해지래 어디나 이제 대시 일세바나시 미기외 초라 미기외 초 개의 디베 자와젤 빼 가신 제바데 전주스 되니 전바 배지 전바 있나 디 안에 전주 딱과래마도 전주원에 말했어 아니 이게 대지 전주에 다 아주 대바셔야지 대 상계를 대바다 되니 대바마도 미게와 자와 짱짱 잘 내버 지킨 게 되니기 지글이야 어디 약보래 삼바이나 니 대바 말해스 게위 미게와 자와 지라 배 지금 쯨데 바이나디 아니 다 지기 쯨 스페시던 거리나 그 무디디 제디바 차거와 제가 쯨중원에 쯨데 말해스 지서 딱 봐 말해스 다 주말에 사진 자기로
However, faith in that which is not an object of faith, such as demons and so forth, and effort in the direction of non-virtue, are imputed faith and effort, but not actual faith and effort. So this is so necessary to distinguish these. So this is similar to what we've discussed already. And now, in terms of faith, it is the same. Faith is a virtuous mental factor, therefore one has faith in a virtuous object. However, whilst in the world we can say one has faith in something that turns out to not be virtuous, that consciousness that has faith in that object is not called faith. So hence we see here, it's imputed faith. So if it's called faith, it's not what is meant here. The name may be applied, but it wouldn't fulfill the meaning here, because faith is a virtuous mental factor, and as we see in the first line, virtuous by way of turning away from the opposite. So faith turns away from non-faith. And this then, it refers to that the object of faith is virtuous, whereas non-faith would be non-virtuous. And similarly with effort, or joyous perseverance, that for something to be joyous perseverance, one needs to be making effort with joy in a virtuous object. If one is making effort with joy in something non-virtuous, this cannot be called joyous effort or joyous perseverance, but rather would be wrong joyous effort, or one would be merely calling it joyous perseverance. So then we can stop here in the text. If you have some questions, we can take questions. And then this afternoon, we will continue from the top of page 24 with root afflictions.
It seems that embarrassment depends upon another negative mind, the attachment to reputation. So if you overcome your attachment to reputation, then you're not going to be embarrassed if you do something wrong.
Embarrassment, the virtue...
By the description of it.
Mm-hmm. So as I understand it, the doubt that I have is that with embarrassment, if it depends on what others will say about oneself, then this it seems to imply that there is an attachment to reputation. But if one has abandoned your attachment to reputation, then surely it follows that one will not be embarrassed anymore, not caring about what others say.
체류에서디 가르레스는 체류에서디 샹레 네버치비 디비 자와 제발 젠바디 체류에서 거래. 지난 젠바 호랑 디 김전에 가르치는 증거는 김전 삼다디 샹사 김전도 제제 디비 자와 젠바디 마치 젠바디를 체류에서 마도 샹지 가람나 가요 말아 선배 삼다 남에 다저디 체류 말해. 니 체육 말와 체육 말 체육에 디비 자월 잼바 주고 그러지. And me shanda kalamna lap ngai semje sugi lamni di cheyo cheg marwa. Di konje jizan cheyo cheg marwa. Shanda kalamna lap shen gal ne na ne mane na ma konjol garjena ngal kyong ngai semje sugi. Lamni di cheyo cheg marwa. Jizan semje odi suene digi mares. Ngai di cheba inna shen la nyugi de shengi kanga chege shengi ka lamya ka dan gagidu sti jini shen gyumchen de jene nani dibi jawa semba jila cheyo la gore jerwa. 맞아. 현재 갈란다 랍 가르지나 제 디삼르디 쳐요 말해. 아니?
얘네들이 맞춰 쳐요 키기 말해. 그래서 거기서 사람마사마 키도 연하래. 쳐요 키도 말해.
인지 미지 쳐요 키 오레스 라마상에 쳐요세데 디니치 랍기레스 모체 제마도 쳐요 키 담아지 능한지 디갑르 키우데 키그 민상한테 심주기 키시가 말아. 쳐요세데 간니치 랍기레 오 간니치 랍기레 람나 셴 김천데 제네 디바 자발 재미야 되라 쳐요 랍기레세. That this also regular unit, then you have a goblet, Shan Jumson, the Chief, some ocean, Jigmare, some Daji, deeper Zampa in the Sosugi, Tail Yore. Sosugi Dibajal, Shan Mazimbaji, Shangi, some Mataji, Sosugi Diba Jebin, Temeba Shower, that he done that.
If others, if one thinks to oneself that others may criticize me for doing this non-virtuous behavior, but not care, then one lacks this virtuous mental factor of embarrassment, as you said. So Gen is expressing it differently from you. You're putting it with something that sounds virtuous, not caring about reputation. Yeah, but if one doesn't care that others will what others think about your behavior in the sense of you engaging in non-virtue, then for sure you do not have this mental factor, this virtuous mental factor of embarrassment. So, for example, well, I'm killing, I know they won't approve, but so what? I don't care what they think. One will continue killing, and part of the reason why one will continue to do so is because one is lacking this virtuous mental factor of embarrassment. Okay. Tanya?
I just want to check that I understand the aggregate of feeling. So one of the divisions is the threefold division of the experience of happiness, the experience of suffering, and the experience of equanimity.
Mm-hmm.
And last night you described it as classes of feelings, 3 different classes. So I want to just clarify, is that talking about the subtle up to the gross? Mm-hmm. So that's the class of feeling, not in terms of the category of I'm feeling angry, so therefore that's a feeling of suffering. So like classifying emotions. So just sort of clarifying that it's actually 3 different feelings, and those feelings are, happiness, suffering, or neutrality, not that they're categories.
And they're all included within the aggregates of feeling.
Well, that's
So if I get it right, so aggregate of feeling was said to be synonymous with feeling, and then we had feeling divided in different ways, including the threefold division, which last night I referred to as 3 different categories. So just to be clear then, those 3 different types or 3 different categories, they referring to happiness, suffering, and neutrality across all its gradation. Okay, thank you.
사세계 소화다 사매계 소화세들와 지난 소화 대화 동안 참아 소화 가능신나 초유 풍부를 거래 초유 풍부는 소화될 기지기지게 지금 뭐 예배 같이 자산이 이 자산 넘네 될 거라 지금 초유 풍부를 이제 나한테 자산 열다.
Yes, in brief. So any way that one divides feelings, whether into 2, 3, or 5, it's included within the, it's synonymous with the aggregate of feeling. And it includes the entire, whichever division, the entire gradient of feelings. So whether one's feeling of happiness is very slight, or what we'd say bliss, or the suffering is very minor, or it's intense, it would all be included within the aggregate of feeling. So it's not that it's separate classes, but it's 3 types, or 2 types, with the gradient included in the entire expanse included in there. Okay.
So if I'm angry, that's not what we're talking about.
Okay.
Lung lang se di chowaram mare di nganzugi lung lang se di nganzu xetang dang kongzho li ligoro di ligma simju kakar chakar ma chowa chakar mare na chowa nyamdu mare chowa la tene ligiri dati nganzu li chowa chik dunga lebe na dele tene nganzu lung lang ya di ligiri.
So anger is a different consciousness, a different mental factor, and it arises following from or in dependence on the feeling of suffering. So they are separate, and there's a sequence. Okay? Okay, good. Anila?
I think I understand why the equanimity division of A, B, and C, that equanimity is a consciousness that experiences a feeling as A and not dependent on an external object, and B and C are how consciousness reacts. But I would have thought A is also dependent on an object. No feeling arises not dependent on any other object, does it?
Yes, exactly. So the threefold division of equanimity, or no, the 3 ways that the word equanimity is used, so this is the middle page 22. The first one refers to a consciousness, an equanimity feeling. The second and the third relates to the object. Yeah, it relates to the objects of being equanimous or being impartial towards different beings, being the same towards them. But surely the first one, though, too, equanimity feeling, whilst a consciousness, also has to have a relationship with an object, because every consciousness requires an object, right? Okay.
Yudu yore. Dade chowa dangyum se di gari kiyorosne, korongi chowa korong ngo gari kiyorosne, dade chiki yana dunga wi choso mata, ngo dunga mayimba, yana dewi ngo mayimba, dinige parachile ngo richi, ngo jeje yuchi nyungor, yunya yuchi nyungor, gari nyo penang zoge, dine dudu chide xingdong robi tongba ina, xingdong tongyo di kabla di yagodu se dukjadu masamba ina xingdong tongde kabla di chowa di ishi chowa di gari nyungor sine, ko chowa tanyam chayor, gari sine, ko yagagi choso sonyo ma duyo choso makson hachi, ko ima dila pa yu xingdong de tongor, jizan di tongyagi chowa dila chowa tanyam da gore, yu yore.
Yes, you are correct. And feeling of equanimity, being a consciousness, will have an object. As you said, every consciousness has its object. So what makes this an equanimous feeling is, for example, if one glances out the window and sees a tree, then with that I sense consciousness, there is a feeling, and that feeling is not necessarily then going to be a feeling of happiness, you just glance at a tree, nor one of suffering, so it will be a neutral or equanimous feeling. So that's the feeling, this consciousness, but it has an object, being that tree. Yeah, so it has an object, but the usage of the word equanimity here is referring specifically to a consciousness, an equanimous feeling. Okay? Okay.
Yeah, that is it.
One problem I have with, and probably fear,
working, the Buddha said, like, you know, work in the outer community. So I do a lot of that with different cultures. One of the things I've found, the more and more that I practice the Dharma with my feelings and emotions, I become very, when people tell me their scripts and their stories and very tragedies, I become very straight, very always straight. And in the culture and gender of our European society, the one thing that we need to show, so we're not judged or labelled as, you know, they've got all these words, narcissist or Asperger's or whatever words, we need to show empathy. I found that one of the things in my practice that happened, that I was so parallel, you know, that I outwardly was my inward. So therefore, I was woken by a family member that I was not showing the necessary physical, emotional signs that were acceptable by the culture, not just the European culture. Well, I was all right with my Asian culture because they, you know, I like that. So, yeah, so that's, am I doing something in my meditation, in my practice incorrect? Or am I heading in the right path? Is this just an obstruction? Because now I have to listen really hard for people's words so that I do the right, acceptable cultural thing outwardly.
So you wanting to check that in your meditation practice, are you perhaps making an error or not? Because you're finding that, I'll use my own words, but your mind is becoming more stable, not so much up and down. And then even when someone is communicating to you about something that for them is quite traumatic, your mind isn't responding in an overt manner, and therefore you're not expressing a strong emotional response. And then from their side, sometimes because this is not in accordance with their culture, then they're feeling that you're not emotionally engaging with them, and this leads to, I don't know, disappointment or whatever from their side. Okay.
Did not check Chago Marwa, Persone, the Choda Jitin Kagare, so what? Chizan Jiongi mi Chike Jidang and the Chizona, two Chike Min Yovachi took Chatlavan, Pale took Chachi, Majavan, or Kojo, Jonam in the Lodge, Dinner some Jinaco, Dinner Jipat, Zivuja, part never yet Yorova, Ding on the Choda meeting Barwa, going on the Chola. 미든 집에는 세복금 고래 파잠지 지고 숨고로 지사디 디레 고 튕고 말봐 지사디 메튼 바 냠len 노아 가 말에 누구와 지사 아 데니 컴페노 미치 땅기를 루디를 데니 남겨 낚시터라 데니 고소로 판게 캐릭 셰프도 말에 그래서 캐릭이야 도 판게 아우에서 아우센 캐릭이야 미치 땅기 말에 야메센 지사 sem di sem matin ba so sem lele de ba de dig de ore de no yo mare de go in na inji mi phajo de kyo shu de nga zu mu ko ska yo mar wa de one din nyamlen che no yo mar de pa de go yo mar nam se mu da si sem kyo de ho che wa so yo mar wa 그런 게 팔에 진짜 파주 가서 그래 미코롱기 강아도 콜이야 셰바이나 아니 셰바이나 거의 봐 되는게 지게 미슈다 되네 마타바네 알레 디데 디르와 진짜 되네 셰바이 강아 셰바이나 디 낭매시 샤에 메라 콜이야 셈수체 다양 수수가 납제토네 가래 제베나 디 거진 제와리 계시 무차거로 마도 다디 야 지금 델야 아다 코로나 강한데 디네레스 낭매샤 초 낭매샤베나 저기 야 코에 그 데두글이야 산마다 와서 책으로 와. 이 산마다베네 야 테스트고 말. 대자 디네 인자 콜이야. 한 셈수체다. 납제로 간에 야네 야가도 대삼당 당와 이렇게 좀 책으로 와.
When we're training our mind, then our mind should become more habituated to staying stable and calm in the face of adversity. This means we start to experience the world and people in a way quite different than we used to. And this means that our way of responding will be different from how it used to, and it may well be out of the norms of society. This is to be expected. For example, and this wasn't your example, but it shows where it happens too. Usually in the world, if someone is angry at us and speaking to us in an abusive way and accusing us of many things, anger arises within us. Our face will go a little bit red, and we may well respond in a similar way. That's the normal way in the world. If one's trained well in patience, one's mind will stay calm and subdued, and one will thereby be able to respond in a skillful way because one's mind is not afflicted. And thereby can either, with a calm mind, say nothing, if one sees that as better, or apologize if one sees that as better, or explain yourself if you feel that's better. And one is more likely to make a right decision on how to respond because one's mind's not afflicted. So that's a skillful way to deal with a difficult situation, but it's not the ordinary way in the world. Similarly, when one has trained one's mind, one hears someone else's either very bad news or very good news, then one's mind is not responding in the normal worldly way of either becoming delighted or also becoming disappointed or sad like they are. So this is a normal, therefore there is no fault in your training, in your meditation. Nevertheless, though, one needs to respond in the second illustration, not the patient's illustration. This illustration in a way in accordance with society, and therefore, when one needs to show compassion, generate compassion for the person suffering before you. Generate empathy for them. You may not be suffering. If compassion arises, you are not suffering. But you can experience, you can relate to the suffering being before you. And in this way, compassion can arise and be expressed through one's facial expression or way of speaking. And likewise, when someone shares news of joy with you, and you can share in their joy without your mind being, it's more evenness, being elated. Your mind can stay even, but you can share in their joy. Okay?
Okay.
Jan Kjersvik?
That is a 중이 start to
Oh, that is Purbuchok. So it's a little bit late, and lunch is going to be getting cold, so maybe later, yeah? Okay, thank you.